I think VR is very interesting, um, but not for the reason people think, especially VR developers, right? So people think that VR is about being more immersed in a game so that it feels real, um, and therefore it can be more compelling or something. And nobody in the game industry seems to want to hear this, but like there is a little bit of truth to that immersion. I will get back to it in a minute about what's true about it, but it's mostly false because when you're watching a good movie, you're immersed. When you're reading a good book, you're immersed. When you're listening to music that you find beautiful, you're immersed. Like immersion doesn't require you to wear a bucket on your head, right? That's uncomfortable and like heavy and all these things. Um, Now, the thing that it does do that's immersive is you get a tighter feedback loop between your proprioceptive sense, like where your head's moving and like what you see, which is absent when you're playing like a 3D game on a monitor because the monitor doesn't move in response to your head. So it incorporates a little bit more of your body. And this is the more important part, I think. Just the tracking on both the headset and the controllers um, tends to be very good these days, actually better on the controllers than the headset. And what that means is you have more bandwidth for communicating to the game, right? In ways that are natural, because you know how to move your hands, you know how to move your head, right? And you can move your body to move your head around to change where you are. And those are relatively natural things compared to, I'm using this mouse and keyboard or something, which is not something that came naturally to humans before we invented it, right? You can learn it in that way that we learn to drive and stuff, but it's one step more removed. And so the opportunity of VR is to use this added bandwidth in order to create experiences that are better in some way to fit, right? So if you think about if I'm playing a 3D game with a mouse and keyboard, my mouse is like, let's call that 2 analog degrees of freedom. It's even not that much, but whatever. And then maybe the keyboard, I have like 5 or 6 keys I'm going to hit. So it's like 5 or 6 bits plus 2 scalar numbers, right?
It's more like VR's advantage isn't that it inputs something that's more immersive to you. It's more what you output that the game can then use.
That's the one that is the most overlooked, I think. Yes. So, just to quantify again, these are technically 6 DOF controllers because there's in 3D space, there's 3 degrees of translation and 3 of rotation. So you have like 18 scalars compared to 2 in your mouse. And it's not actually that much because humans don't really use them independently, but it's like a lot more, right? And so until now, games mostly talk and don't listen very much. Like think about if you're playing a game at 4K at 24-bit color at 60 frames per second, that's like a lot of bits per second coming at you. The number of bits per second going in is like several orders of magnitude less than that.
Right.
Like way less. So what can you do when you have more? We don't exactly know because I think designers dropped the ball a little bit in this last wave of VR. I think this last wave of VR would have been like people usually think, oh, it's because the hardware technology isn't good enough. I do think VR will get more successful as the hardware gets better, but I think designers dropped the ball, and it would have been more successful if designers had understood the opportunity and taken advantage of it.
You called it a wave, meaning that we're on the lower end now?
Yeah, it's pretty clear at this point that VR, like, okay, so when Palmer Luckey started Oculus, and then, Valve had also been working on VR at that time, and then Sony got into it, and like everybody was releasing VR systems. There was this possibility at that time that maybe this is like the future of all this stuff. From now, it's just going to be this gets better. And, I think most of the people who bought VR systems during that time, those are like in their closet right now or something, or they're not being used daily, right? That's true for me. And so, well, what causes people to get those things out of their closet, or what's the next system that does better that won't go into the closet quite so fast, right?
Are you planning on making a VR game, and or do you have ideas for VR games?
I have lots of ideas for VR games. Not super deep ones. They're just more like starting points, because like I said, this process of making games is pretty hard and you have to get really into it. And we never really started on any of these ideas, so it's hard to say where they would have gone. But for sure, I see interesting places to start. For a studio of our size, we can't really make VR games right now because we can't afford to. Because if nobody buys it, it's out of business, right? That might change in the future, but at this time, it's just not really something that we could do.